I'm a farmer in Spain, and I'd like to share two remarkable episodes I've experienced. The first happened on a stuffy May night some years ago, under the intense glow of a full moon. It was around 4 a.m. and I was plowing the land. I noticed that one of the plow discs seemed to move unusually. I thought maybe a bolt was missing, so I decided to disassemble the piece to avoid problems. I lay under the equipment to make the adjustment, and when I looked up at the sky for a moment, something unusual caught my attention. 3 lights perfectly aligned in a triangle. I quickly got up and moved away from the tractor to get a better view, avoiding the reflection of the lights. The lights began to spin at high speed and, in a matter of seconds, disappeared into the horizon with a speed I had never seen before. I stood there, stunned, trying to process what I had just witnessed. The second incident was much more frightening and occurred recently, in October 2023, during the planting season. That night, my father was using another tractor to spray weeds, but had to stop due to strong winds. Here we call this type of wind cerso if it comes from the east, or gallego if it blows from the west. He radioed me to say he was heading home, but I decided to continue working on the lot he had already sprayed. The hours dragged on, and it was past 2 a.m. when I realized I would need a bit more time to finish. The tractors we use have cameras on the back, allowing us to monitor the work without having to look directly behind. Right after calling my mother to let her know I was finishing up, I turned off the phone and almost immediately looked at the camera screen. What I saw there froze me. A white humanoid figure was sitting on the cedar. At first, I thought it might be a reflection of the lights, but I quickly dismissed that idea since the camera images are always very clear. I turned to look directly, and there it was, motionless, with its back to me. I stopped the tractor, not knowing how to react. Gathering courage, I got out of the cab to approach it. When I got closer, the figure turned abruptly, revealing a face I'll never forget. It was a small woman with eyes that weren't eyes but black cavities. Terror overwhelmed me, and I fainted on the spot. I woke up around 4 a.m. with a severe headache and no clear understanding of where I was. I decided to call it a night and head home. As I drove, I tried to convince myself that it had all been an illusion, perhaps caused by extreme fatigue. When I got home, my parents and grandparents were already up, tending to the cattle. I went straight to my room, but sleep didn't come. The next morning, while talking to my grandmother, I mentioned the lot where I had been working. Her expression changed immediately, and in a firm, apprehensive tone, she simply said, "Don't go back there at night." Curious, I told her what had happened. Her reaction was immediate. She made the sign of the cross, grabbed her rosary, and started praying. Confused, I asked why she reacted that way. It was then that she shared a story that sent chills down my spine. In her childhood, she said, that area was occupied by an almost deserted village, with only 2 elderly couples who eventually moved to nearby villages. After the place was abandoned, the ruins were demolished, and the land became farmland. But there was a terrible legend associated with that place. They said that an outsider had abused and murdered a young woman, gouging out her eyes before burying her in the local cemetery. Since then, stories of her appearing to scare unsuspecting farmers were frequent. My grandmother recalled a particularly gruesome case many years ago. A young man was found dead in a nearby lot. His body had completely white eyes, a twisted mouth, and a broken neck. Although the official version was that he had fallen, the expression of horror on his face fueled the belief that he had been a victim of the spirit of that woman. Despite trying to maintain a rational stance, what happened next shook my disbelief. While we were working on building a drainage system in the upper part of the land to prevent flooding, we ended up unearthing several skeletons buried there. Since then, I've never risked working at night in that area again. This event forever changed my view of the supernatural. Some years ago, I had an experience that has never left my memory. My neighbor at the time was a woman in her 60s or 70s who, having never had children, decided to fill that void by buying a doll, which she treated as if it were a real child. She cared for it with all the affection, dressed it, caressed it, took it for walks around the neighborhood, and even baptized it with a name. That doll was like the child she never had. One night, as I was returning from work, I found her in the park near our house, accompanied by her inseparable doll. We talked for a while, but a heavy rain started suddenly. Concerned about the storm, I invited her to come to my house, where we could have a hot tea and continue our conversation. She quickly accepted, but in her haste to escape the rain, she left the doll behind on the bench where we had been sitting. While we were having tea and talking, we were interrupted by knocking at the door. This seemed strange since we weren't expecting any visitors. I invited the lady to accompany me to the door to see what was happening. We peeked through the window, and what we saw left us speechless. In the rain, there was the doll. At first, I thought someone might have brought it, but what happened next was even more disturbing. Both of us clearly heard a child's voice say, "Mommy, open the door, I'm cold." We froze, terrified. Without thinking much, we ran to my room and locked ourselves in, trembling and trying to process what had happened. Time seemed to stand still, but after a few minutes, we gathered the courage to go back and check the door again. To our surprise or relief, the doll was gone. It was never seen again. From that day on, something changed deeply in my neighbor. She seemed distant, as if part of her had been left behind that night. Not long after, I moved away from that house and never heard from her again. To this day, I remember that episode as the most frightening moment I've ever experienced. Good evening, everyone. I want to share my story, the most painful and shameful I've ever lived through. I ask that you keep my anonymity for reasons you'll soon understand. I'm a young woman living in Mexico, and I had a relationship of over 4 years with a man who at first seemed like the perfect partner. Tall, hardworking, romantic, and dedicated. After 3 years together, he suggested we move in together, and I agreed. Not long after, he proposed that we start a family, and I soon became pregnant. That's when my nightmare began. His behavior changed abruptly. From a loving companion, he became aggressive, authoritarian, and even violent. Fights were constant, and he seemed irritated by everything. Moreover, our financial situation deteriorated, and I, pregnant and with few months to go, began to go hungry. The breaking point came during an argument when he physically assaulted me, sending me to the hospital. Unfortunately, I lost the baby. After the incident, he apologized, promised to change, and acted as if nothing had happened. Hopeful, I gave him another chance. However, his mood swings became constant, sometimes affectionate, other times indifferent. Meanwhile, my health began to deteriorate. Episodes of vomiting and diarrhea became daily, and I started losing weight alarmingly, to the point where I could see my own bones. Even so, doctors found no physical causes for my condition, suggesting anemia or iron deficiency, but the tests were normal. Additionally, I began to have disturbing experiences at night. It felt like I was being watched when I was alone. I would sense something entering the room, like an invisible presence that would sink the mattress beside me. I would be paralyzed, unable to move or scream, feeling something heavy climbing over me, suffocating me. Some mornings, I would wake up with bruises, scratches, and unexplained marks on my body, especially on my neck and ribs. This sequence of events reached its peak when I started vomiting large amounts of blood. Desperate, my mother realized this wasn't natural, especially since doctors couldn't explain the symptoms. It was a mix of physical and emotional anguish that seemed to surpass any rational understanding. Without finding answers in medical offices, we decided to seek help from witches and spiritualists. There were 7 failed attempts with professionals who only charged for materials and useless rituals until someone directed us to a man in the city of Puebla, on the border with Veracruz. As soon as we arrived, he was direct. "Daughter, your situation is very serious. If you survive, it will be by the grace of God because this is already too advanced. I'll try to help, but I can't promise anything." With fear, we entered and listened to what he had to say. He described in detail my relationship, my husband's behavior, and the tragedy of losing the baby. But he clarified, "The culprit isn't your husband. It's someone else, someone very close to your family. I can't reveal it now. We need to first remove the evil that's in you." He began the work, prepared a tea, and gave me specific instructions to take it at home. He warned, "Don't tell anyone in your house about these visits. The evil you carry will try to prevent you from coming back. Come every 3 days without fail." I followed the instructions and took the tea. Immediately, I ran to the bathroom, vomiting blood mixed with balls of hair. Terrified, my mother tried to help me while following the man's instructions for the necessary care. During the most critical moments, after 3 sessions, something impressive happened. He asked about the doctor's diagnosis after I lost the baby. I explained that they said it was impossible for me to get pregnant again because my uterus was compromised and a new pregnancy would be fatal. He smiled and assured me, "Forget that, you'll still have 2 children. But first, we need to remove what's inside you." He asked my mother to hold me firmly while he began a ritual with scissors, making movements like cuts in the air in the shape of a cross, especially around my belly. With each gesture, I felt unbearable pain as he explained. "It will hurt, but it's necessary." As the spiritual cut progressed from my lower belly toward my breasts, I vomited blood and more balls of hair. But then something different happened. I felt something moving inside me, and as I screamed for my mother, I squatted, and something started coming out that looked like the tail of a snake. With effort, my mother and I finally removed a small snake, about 4 inches long, already lifeless. Despite that, the animal seemed to resist coming out. We handed it to the man, who placed the snake in a jar along with other materials, stating that this was the evil that had been inside me. It was then that the man revealed who was behind it all. My mother-in-law, my husband's mother. She had never accepted me and didn't want us to form a family. That's why she spent a large sum of money on a work to make me slowly fall ill and prevent me from having children. The goal was clear, to make me suffer until the end. According to him, the animal found in my body had entered through something I ingested. However, the most intense challenge was yet to come. The next 3 days would be decisive. The man warned that I would need to resist what I would feel or see during those nights. Otherwise, I wouldn't survive. To ensure my protection, he decided to stay at my house. The first night was terrifying. Strange sounds echoed through the house, footsteps in the hallway, knocks on the doors, dishes falling to the floor, and faucets turning on by themselves. The dogs howled non-stop, increasing the sense of terror. I had a high fever and visions of frightening creatures. One of them stuck in my memory, a tall being with wrinkled skin, a grayish-brown tone, long fingers, and a tilted head. It stood at the foot of my bed, breathing disturbingly and laughing as if mocking me. This torment lasted until the early hours of the morning when it finally disappeared. On the second night, my mother was attacked. However, thanks to the prayers and protections of the man, the damage wasn't greater. On the third night, he took additional precautions, spreading salt by the windows, doors, and under the bed, besides praying non-stop, alternating between Spanish and an unknown language. When the sun rose, I asked for food for the first time in months. My mother, emotional, cried as she saw me hungry and with the strength to eat. After that, the man asked me if I wanted to return the evil to my mother-in-law. He explained that the spell would go back to its author, but it was my decision. Despite everything, I chose to let God take care of my mother-in-law's fate. The man respected my choice and, refusing any payment, only asked to be included in my prayers. 3 months later, my mother-in-law's fate took another turn. When my husband discovered the whole truth, he cut all ties with her. She began to wither away with symptoms similar to those I had faced. Hospitalized on IV and a respirator, she didn't survive. Before dying, she confessed everything to her son, saying she only wanted the best for him and didn't believe I was the right one for him. Amid pleas for forgiveness, she passed away. It took me a year to fully recover. Today, I dedicate my life to helping those who face similar situations. I reinforce that it's essential to seek help as soon as possible. There are circumstances that medicine can't explain, but other practices can bring answers. This story was shared by my partner not long ago. A few years ago, she used to frequently visit a cousin, always accompanied by her mother. They would spend the day together because the cousin was deeply saddened by her inability to have children. A uterine problem made her infertile, and this reality affected both her and her husband, plunging them into an atmosphere of melancholy. On one of these days, the cousin's husband went out to work in the fields, carrying a backpack on his back and a machete tied to his waist. As he followed his usual path, something unusual happened. He began to hear the sound of a baby crying. At first, he tried to ignore it, thinking his mind was playing tricks on him. However, the sound grew louder, becoming more and more insistent. Determined, he tried to locate the source of the crying but couldn't figure out where it was coming from. The sound was so disturbing that, in a moment of instinct, he decided to open his backpack, as if something compelled him to check. As he emptied it, he found something that made his blood run cold. A large, white worm with an unusual appearance rested at the bottom. The most disturbing part, however, was that the baby's cry was coming from that worm. Terrified, the man took the machete from his waist and, in an act of desperation, cut the worm in half. As soon as he did, the crying stopped immediately. A few days later, my partner told me that during another visit, she and her mother found the cousin very debilitated. The woman was feverish, trembling, and experiencing severe abdominal pain. By chance, the cousin's husband was also present at the time and recounted the story of the worm found in the backpack, describing in detail how he had eliminated it. Upon hearing this, my partner and her mother asked when exactly the symptoms had started. The man replied that everything coincided with the day he found and killed the strange worm. This coincidence left everyone baffled. No one could understand how the events could be connected. Fortunately, over time, the cousin fully recovered and the symptoms disappeared completely. A few days later, my partner's grandmother learned of what had happened. She shared a belief that left everyone even more intrigued. According to her, there's an idea that the children a couple cannot have sometimes manifest as white worms that appear near them. By killing the worm, the woman connected to it would feel the consequences, as there's an inexplicable connection between them. This idea, as strange as it is unsettling, left us all wondering. To this day, we don't know what to think about this story. Perhaps it's just a sequence of coincidences, or perhaps there's something deeper behind it. What's certain is that the event was peculiar, and maybe it's better to leave this mystery unanswered.